Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Grisly History, and welcome to the last story in this long saga we've called Ends of the Earth. We've come a long way since John Franklin took his first tottering steps into Canada back in 1819. We've watched ambition drive kingdoms to send their bravest, if not brightest, men to the farthest, most inhospitable corners of the globe, to chart new courses and raise their flags over a land very few would ever see. The prospect of wealth and prestige motivated both nations and their explorers to pour an incredible amount of lives and financial resources into a contest of wits and endurance, the likes of which the world had never seen before. These were not simply contests of survival or discovery, but of speed. For whomever could be the first to best Mother Nature and control her most wayward lands and waterways was one to be feared and respected. We've watched these races play out over the course of years, with numerous men losing life and limb to the ice, to blindly stumble through hundreds of miles season after season. It is fitting, then, that the story should end here, in a contest where the competitors started on equal footing and raced for a finish line a continent away. But before we discuss that race, we should first examine its opponents. When we last left off, it was 1904, and Robert Scott had done what no other had done before. He had not only led a team across Antarctica's great ice barrier, but he had also climbed a glacier and blazed the first trail onto the continent itself. The men of the Discovery Expedition returned home as so many before them, to parades, promotions, and publicity. But aside from the superficial celebrations of the public, there was something lacking: prestige amongst their peers. The whole venture had been funded on the premise that the crew of the Discovery would achieve new scientific insights into the far continent's ecology and geology. While there were indeed some small contributions made into the understanding of its weather and penguins, the whole trip seemed far more occupied with setting new records than the pursuit of serious science. What's more, there were allegations amongst former crewmates, namely Ernest Shackleton, that Scott had bungled his way into success, with salacious examples such as the killing of the sled dogs, whose demise he carelessly brought about through overwork and forced cannibalism. Though Scott had achieved much success, these charges haunted and incensed him. He went on to marry, to mingle with London high society, and to command state-of-the-art naval vessels. But in spite of his achievements, his mind kept turning back to Antarctica, where he felt a longing to finish what he had started. He became territorial over McMurdo Sound, paranoid that others would use his trail to go all the way to the pole. His paranoia was confirmed in 1907, when scorned teammate Ernest Shackleton led his own expedition through Victoria Land, despite Scott's insistence that he find his own way. Though Shackleton fell short of the pole, he beat Scott's record and was even knighted for the attempt. The burning desire Scott held to return to Antarctica was only stoked by a complicated drama playing out in the realm of polar exploration. In 1909, American Frederick Cook claimed to have reached the North Pole with 2 Inuit in 1908. It was celebrated in America, and in September sailed to Copenhagen to receive more laud. In the middle of a celebration dinner, it was announced that fellow American Robert Peary had also claimed to reach the pole that year by dog sled with another American and 2 Inuit in April of 1909. This touched off a bitter battle in which the two men attempted to discredit each other, and to this day it is not clear who, if either of them, reached the pole first. Scott saw the writing on the wall. Whatever the outcome of this spat, reaching the North Pole would no longer hold the same appeal as it once did. To reach it would obviously still be a titanic accomplishment, but it wouldn't be the same as being the first to do so. For daring men seeking to make a name for themselves, there was one frontier left: the South. Rumors emerged of preparations being made for Nordic and Japanese expeditions, and Scott knew that he had to act quickly if he was going to secure the funding and equipment necessary to beat them there. As he raced to acquire men and materiel, he also reached out to other veteran explorers for advice, including that of an unexpected contender, Roald Amundsen. Roald Amundsen's background was altogether different from Scott's. His family lineage had no proud history of military service, but rather he came from a long line of captains and ship owners. These men lived solitary lives, away from home for months and even years as they took to the high seas. His mother knew this and made him swear not to follow in his father's footsteps, and so he honored her wishes by pursuing medicine. But while away at school, his mother died, and at 21 years old, Amundsen abandoned his promise and left school to answer the call of the sea that he had heard for so many years before. Growing up, Amundsen spent a good deal of his free time on his family's ships, learning not only how to operate them, but to operate them in icy conditions that exist around Norway. When he wasn't on a ship, he was reading about them. His favorite stories were those of the Arctic sailors. At the age of 15, he discovered the accounts of Sir John Franklin's expeditions in Canada and into the Arctic archipelago, and swore to himself that he would do what no other had done before and complete a continuous voyage of the Northwest Passage. However, he recognized that he needed experience to match his ambition, and so began picking up ship work wherever he could. In 1897, at the age of 25, he got his first big break when he joined a Belgian expedition to Antarctica. The expedition was not very successful, as it became ice-locked around the peninsula, where the crew spent the winter battling scurvy. Amundsen noted that the crew was saved in large part because of American doctor Frederick Cook, one of the very men who first laid claim to the North Pole. Despite the expedition's shortcomings, Amundsen proved himself and began laying the groundwork for his quest into the passage. 6 years later, in 1903, he managed to scrape together the funds for a 45-ton shipping vessel called the Yoa. The Yoa had a 13-horsepower diesel engine and no ice-breaking capability, but he reasoned that its smaller size would better allow him to hug the shore and go where large naval vessels could not. Amundsen prepared thoroughly, training for 5 months on the vessel with a seasoned Arctic explorer and reading through every Arctic travel log he could get his hands on, thinking through every contingency he might face. In 1903, he took a 6-man crew and sailed into the Canadian archipelago and spent the next 2 years navigating the maze that had claimed so many before him. In the winter months, when the Yoa became icebound, he and his men sledged onto the ice, taking measurements of the magnetic North Pole and interacting with the Inuit. His time with the Inuit was invaluable, as he took detailed notes about how they dressed, traveled, and hunted. Finally, in autumn of 1905, he sailed into the Beaufort Sea before the Yoa once again became ice-locked. Not to be deterred, he and his men ice-skied for 500 miles to Eagle, Alaska, to telegraph the news that the first continuous journey of the Northwest Passage had been completed. As so many before, Amundsen and his crew returned home as celebrities, and those in exploring circles wondered where he would go next. The North Pole seemed like the next natural step for a man who had sailed where no other before him had been able to. And in truth, Amundsen was toying with the idea. He knew that he wanted to sail around the Arctic basin next, and perhaps while there he could find a short route to the pole. But as he was raising funds in 1909, the news broke that Robert Peary may have reached the pole already. In the subsequent controversy, explorers busied themselves arguing over who had reached the pole first, but Amundsen did not trouble himself, and instead took interest in the very recent English expeditions to the South Pole. He studied them at length, and felt that with a smaller team and different equipment, he could go where they had been unable. It was already known that he was planning a North Pole expedition, and he did not announce otherwise. Instead, he continued acquiring materials and men, ostensibly for that original mission. He contacted Swede Fridtjof Nansen, who had very nearly made it to the pole himself a decade prior, and bought the very ship that he had used, called the Fram. Instead of cotton clothing, he acquired skins in the style that he had seen the Inuit use, and purchased small sleds and teams of sled dogs to travel as he had seen them travel. With a crew of 19 men assembled, he looked to begin his approach to Antarctica in 1910, when he received an interesting letter from a certain Robert Falcon Scott. Scott's letter informed him that he was planning his own expedition to the South Pole, and since Amundsen was apparently going to the North Pole, they should coordinate their timing and compare meteorological and magnetic data. Needless to say, this put Amundsen in a precarious place. While Amundsen had been able to quietly acquire men and materials, Scott faced some unique difficulties. Despite his previous success in Antarctica, he had trouble finding funding for another expedition. Unlike the previous venture, he made it clear that this time the primary goal was that of reaching the South Pole, and that the scientific objectives would be a secondary matter. This bolstered the arguments of his critics that Scott was more interested in glory-seeking than making meaningful discoveries on the southern continent. And what this meant in practice was that the organizations that had funded the discovery expedition, such as the Royal Geographic Society, would not campaign to fund this journey. Instead, Scott had to secure his own funding, and his initially ambitious plans would have to be scaled back. Within a few months, it became apparent that his quest would not be like the Discovery Project. He would have to settle for an older ship and no relief vessels. In fact, the ship he eventually acquired was a relief vessel used during the Discovery Expedition, an old Scottish whaling ship called the Terra. He obtained the money for it through a government grant, and once he acquired most of his 65-man crew, he sent it south ahead of him so that he could continue to acquire funding and other provisions. He and his companions had to do a bit of globe-trotting for some of what they needed, including motorized sledges from Norway and ponies from Far East Asia. You see, after Shackleton had broken his promise to Scott not to explore his territory, Scott decided that nothing was off the table and began to borrow what he saw as the better aspects of Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. On that expedition, Shackleton took a mixed-use approach to transport, employing not only sled dogs, but motorized sledges and Siberian ponies as well. After his previous experience, Scott did not trust sled dogs and was determined that he should avoid over-reliance on them by using motorized sledges and ponies as well. His thinking was that he would use them to create relay teams to bring material from the shore to the base of the glacier without wearing out his men. From there, they would scale the glacier and use whatever dogs remained for the race south. For about a year, from 1909 to 1910, Scott raised funds and sent out men ahead of him to acquire materials to be picked up on a roundabout journey south. Finally, in June of 1910, the Terra left Cardiff for South Africa, where Scott joined it for a journey to Australia and then New Zealand for final supplies. It was in Melbourne that Scott was informed that a telegram was waiting for him from Roald Amundsen. Thinking that Amundsen had forgotten his request to compare data, Scott delightedly opened the note, only to discover that Amundsen was at that very same time proceeding south himself. What had been a race in the broad sense of the term had just become a race in a very literal sense. Having gathered the last of the supplies, the Terra set out from New Zealand on November 19th. Amundsen's note gave no hint as to where the Norwegians were intending to establish a base, but Scott hoped to quickly make his way to the McMurdo Sound area and run anyone else off who tried to land there. His hopes were hampered by heavy storms in early December. The old Terra proved to be prone to leaking, and at times the storms raged so badly that the leaking water extinguished their coal fires. By the end of it, 2 ponies and a dog were lost, along with 10 tons of coal and 65 gallons of petrol. Then, in a stroke of what Scott referred to as sheer bad luck, the Terra ran into pack ice while crossing the Antarctic Circle. The ice delayed them from reaching the continent by another 20 days and cost them 6 more tons of coal. Finally, in early January, Ross Island was sighted, and the crew set to work trying to find an ice-free spot to land. At first they thought they might establish their base on the eastern side of the island, as it would have not only given them a leg up on the journey across the ice, but also because there was an abundance of penguins that might be hunted in the event of a scurvy outbreak. However, the swells were too great to permit them to unload the ship safely, and after having burned through so much of their coal reserves, they weren't able to wait for better conditions. Instead, they sailed around to the western side, to a little cape Scott named after his second-in-command, Lieutenant Edward Evans. Cape Evans would provide protection for the ship once winter weather froze the sea around the shore, and would further give them access to Hut Point, where Scott had established a base back in 1902. The men set to work immediately, unloading the ship on January 4th. Apart from the loss of one of the 3 motorized sledges, which fell through a thin spot in the ice, the unloading went quite well. The men made use of 2 ice caves near the shore, using one as a meat freezer and the other as a storage room. They worked there for 2 weeks until they finally established a prefabricated hut and began planning the next phase of the expedition. As the expedition had been unable to secure funding for relief vessels, Scott had to anticipate the next year's needs, and after some deliberation, he wrote chiefly to request mules to be sent in case too many of the ponies died that season. Along with his requests went the final letters of the crew to their loved ones back home, and the Terra left, leaving the men alone and out of contact for the next year. However, not everyone got off on this stop. A scientific team, led by former Navy officer Victor Campbell, sailed to the east, where they attempted to land in the largely unexplored King Edward VII land. After a number of failed landing attempts, and with winter closing in, Campbell ordered the Terra Nova to sail back westward that they may find a spot in familiar Victoria Land. It was on this return voyage, while passing by the Bay of Whales, that the men encountered the Norwegian expedition. At the same time that Scott was beginning his depot laying for the journey south, Campbell approached the Norwegian camp and met with Amundsen and his men. By his account, Amundsen was quite courteous, allowing Campbell to tour their camp and see the equipment they were working with. He even offered to help them with their sled dogs, but Campbell declined, and as a matter of explorer's etiquette, set out west across the ice to find a new locale to establish their base. They eventually decided against setting up their own winter camp and made the long march back to Cape Evans to spend the winter with Scott's party. At this point, I think that this is a good place to flesh out some of the other personnel, their responsibilities, and the equipment they brought along. As I previously mentioned, Scott's second-in-command was Lieutenant Edward Evans, a man who had previously served on one of the relief vessels of the Discovery expedition. Also returning from the Discovery expedition was Tom Crean, William Lashley, Edgar Evans, and Scott's close friend, Dr. Edward Wilson, the latter two of which would make up part of the final South Pole team. Some other important members of the new crew included officers Henry Bowers and Lawrence Oates. Bowers was a lieutenant in the Royal Indian Marines, while Oates was a captain in the 6th Inniskillen Dragoons. Oates' experience with horses in the Dragoons led him to being in charge of the care and work of the expedition's horses. What also secured Oates' responsibilities was his donation of £1,000 to the expedition, an amount equal to nearly £140,000 in today's money. Another important character in the story is Apsley Cherry Garrard, whose 1922 memoir, The Worst Journey in the World, provides the most vivid account of the expedition. Cherry Garrard was an exceptionally hard worker during the expedition, and he had to work exceptionally hard just to join it. He was only in his mid-20s and had no previous experience. He was a protege of Dr. Wilson's and submitted £1,000 of his own in addition to his application to join. Scott, however, turned him down based on his lack of experience and rather severe myopia. Nevertheless, Cherry Garrard allowed his contribution to stand, something which impressed Scott and persuaded him to take the young man along on the journey. In addition to these men were a collection of scientists in the fields of physics, geology, meteorology, zoology, and biology. Though the primary purpose of the journey was to be the first to reach the South Pole, Scott was determined to bring back hard data on the continent. He did this by having scientific teams in place to conduct their own independent research while the main team focused on the pole. For the sake of brevity, I will really only be focusing on Scott's race, but it's worth noting that considerable time and attention was spent collecting previously unknown information about the Antarctic climate. But, focusing in on the race, we need to talk about the differences in approach between the English and Norwegian teams. As I mentioned earlier, Scott took a somewhat eclectic approach, taking what he saw as the best ideas from other expeditions. After coming through the December storms, and after some mishaps unloading the ship, the crew of the Terra Nova had 32 sled dogs, 18 Siberian ponies, and 2 motorized sledges to work with. Scott seemed to be hedging his bets on what would prove to be the most effective mode of transport, but he did not fully invest in any one of them. He had the forethought to hire experts for the dogs and ponies, but did not outfit them with essential equipment. One example of this is the lack of snowshoes for the ponies. Without them, their hooves struggled to keep traction on the ice, and as a result kept an inconsistent pace. Likewise, Scott brought along skis for the men, but not enough for every man, once again causing inconsistent pacing amongst team members. It was half measures like these, brought about either by lack of funds or foresight, that kept the English team handicapped throughout the race. By comparison, the Norwegian team decided on a strategy and invested themselves wholly into it. Amundsen decided to base much of his plan on the customs he had observed the Inuit to use. He ordered 100 Greenland sled dogs to carry supplies and men alike. To further increase his speed, he equipped every man with his own pair of skis, which were to be used when not being pulled by dogs. Finally, the crew was almost exclusively outfitted with animal skin clothing and sleeping bags, rather than traditional cotton and wool. The reasoning behind this was that wearing pelt skins required less layering, and better allows one's skin to breathe. Furthermore, They wick away moisture, reducing the occurrence of sweat building up and freezing within the garments. If you've listened to other episodes in this series, then you know that this was a major contributing factor to hypothermia amongst explorers. It was one for Scott's team as well, as his men were clothed in cotton and fur, which didn't have that moisture-wicking benefit of skins. As we will go on to see, this would pose a considerable problem for the English during the race. Now, about that race. After the Terra sailed away, the men had about half a year to prepare for the journey. Their plan was to establish a second base further inland and to lay preliminary depots along the ice barrier so that supplies would already be in place once Antarctic summer came. As a first order of business, they set out to establish Safety Camp at 80 degrees south. This camp would be their base from which all overland journeys would be launched. 500 miles of craggy, marbled ice lay between them and their ascension point, Beardmore Glacier. And the more depots the expedition could lay down before the race, the swifter they could cross those 500 miles. The depot team comprised 12 men, 8 of the fittest ponies, and 2 dog sled teams. Unfortunately, icy conditions prevented the use of the motorized sledges. But, departing in what Cherry Garrard described as a state of hurry bordering on panic, the team set out south. After a week of marching, they established Corner Camp, about 60 miles away from where they had started. Progress was slow, in large part due to the ponies' lack of snowshoes. They couldn't keep up with the dogs, and at times they had to keep them separated, as the dogs were prone to attacking the horses for their meat. Compounding the problem was the fact that the ponies were unprepared for the climate. Having just come through the tropics, they were still in their summer coats. At the end of each day, the men would erect a wall of snow to block as much wind as they could from the creatures, but in spite of their best efforts, 2 of the ponies died just a week into the journey. About 10 days after setting out, there was a very real concern that the remaining horses would perish. So Scott ordered some of the men to take the weakest 3 back to base. Unfortunately, only 1 of the 3 had the necessary strength to make it back, as the other 2 succumbed to exhaustion and exposure. Meanwhile, Oates debated with Scott that the pony's strength must be used to the fullest to lay supplies as far south as possible, even if that meant working them to death and slaughtering them for their meat. Scott mulled this over, but eventually decided that they would need every pony possible for the following season, and decided he would do his best to save them, even if that meant turning back prematurely. This is eventually what happened on February the 16th. After nearly 3 weeks of marching, the temperatures began to plunge to negative 21 degrees, with strong winds picking up from the southwest. Some of the men, including Scott, were suffering from frostbite, and the ponies were beginning to grow lethargic. It was a tough call, but the men decided to depot their supplies 30 miles north of their original target. This became known as One Ton Camp, where the team deposited 7 weeks' worth of food and 12 weeks' worth of oil, along with food and supplies for the animals as well. This camp would be the last big supply point for the men returning from the pole. Reaching it would be crucial to ensuring their survival for the final 150-mile stretch of the journey. After laying the depot, the men made their return to Hut Point, suffering a near disaster when an entire dog sled team plunged through a crevasse. The only thing keeping them from plummeting into the abyss was the weight of the men and gear still on the sledge. The dogs hung there helplessly, choking in their harnesses, until they were cut loose and lifted up one by one. Later that day, the men arrived at an eerily empty safety camp. However, the following day they were met by the other party, who informed Scott of their encounter with the Norwegians before returning to the ship and heading to Robertson Bay where they would spend the winter. According to Cherry Garrard, Scott's initial reaction was to sledge to the Bay of Whales and have it out with them. However, after taking some time to cool off and consider the matter, he decided his efforts were better spent preparing for the race. Scott wrote in his diary that, quote, "The proper as well as wiser course for us is to proceed exactly as though this had not happened. To go forward and to do our best for the honor of the country without fear or panic. There is no doubt that Amundsen's plan is a menace to ours. He has a shorter distance to the pole by 60 miles. He can start his journey early in the season, an impossible condition with the ponies." Unquote. Sensing that Amundsen had the upper hand, Scott determined that more supplies should be taken south in spite of the coming winter. Unfortunately, the dogs were in no condition to make the journey again, so he ordered a few men to remain behind and nurse them back to health. He instead took a small party of men and the remaining horses and attempted to take as much as he could back south. However, the following day, it was apparent that the horses would not survive without immediate rest, and so Scott ordered the men back to safety camp, where they would regroup and march together to the more sheltered base at Hut Point. But getting back to Hut Point would be tricky, as by now the sea around the shore had frozen, and the men would have to carefully make their way over the sea ice to get back to the island. While crossing over the ice, one of the 5 horses, whom they referred to as Weary Willie, collapsed, and gravely concerned about the health of the other 4, Scott decided to split the party and send them ahead. He tasked former Indian Marine Henry Bowers, a man with no previous polar experience, to lead the animals, along with Jerry Garrard and Tom Crean. The 3 marched out onto the ice and eventually made camp. Bowers recalled that they were so tired that while attempting to make hot cocoa, he accidentally mixed in curry powder instead, and that Tom Crean drank the entire cup before noticing. Just 2.5 hours later, while the men were sleeping, a great cracking sound erupted around them. Shooting up, the men realized that the ice they were on had broken up, and they were now in a field of broken ice as far as their eyes could see. Rushing to where they had made a wall for the horses, they saw that a crack had gone straight through it, and one of the horses was missing. 2 of the sledges they brought were on another floe, and rushing out in his socks, Bowers pulled the 2 of them back onto their chunk of ice. Jerry Garrard tried to get Bowers to abandon the gear and ponies, that they may save themselves by jumping from floe to floe back to shore, but Bowers was adamant that they had to bring everything back with them. It was then that the killer whales arrived. Jerry Garrard recalled it like this, quote, "Killer whales were cruising about in great numbers, snorting and blowing, while occasionally they would in some extraordinary way raise themselves and look about over the ice, resting the forepart of their enormous yellow and black bodies on the edge of the floes. They were undisguisedly interested in us and the ponies, and we felt that if we once got into the waters, our ends would be swift and bloody." Unquote. The excitement will not end. Nothing will hold still. Your lungs pump out breath as quickly as you can suck it in. The ice below you continuously bobs with the current, and the god-awful neighing will not cease. Hunched over on your hands and knees, you squeeze your eyes shut and try to breathe. Half an hour ago, your eyes were closed, lying in the tent, and you could almost swear that you had been sleeping. Then, all at once, there had been shouting, that horrid, cracking tremor that roused you all to your feet. You have not been to battle, but you feel certain that you now know what the concussion of cannon fire feels like. You scrambled up from your sack, bounded out into the brisk air, and took in the bedlam. The floe was breaking up. The sleds were on one chunk of ice, while the horses were on another. But not quite all the horses. A long black tongue of seawater stretched right through the ice wall of the horse pen, and just below where Guts the pony had been. Guts was gone now, and the other animals were terribly frightened. But then there was Bowers, your sock-clad officer, shouting orders and charging ahead like Galahad to save the sledges. You turned around and stumbled forward, slipping on the ice, and fought your way back to the tent. You grabbed for your boots and jammed both feet in before standing up and carefully stepping back out. Everything around you was a blur. You thought you could manage down here without spectacles, with nothing but endless white plains of ice around. What would you need to see that wasn't already at arm's length? But now things have changed. All around you, the ground has given way. Your equipment is floating away from you, and a false step will send you plunging into unimaginably cold water. Even if your companions could pull you out before the sea swallowed you, you would almost certainly die shaking and chattering out on this vast field of fractured ice. Through hazy, myopic eyes, you assess the scene around you. By some miracle, Bowers had wrestled the sledges onto your little island. Now he and Crean were eyeing the ponies and discussing how to get to them. You fumbled forward and cried out that it was madness, that the lives of the horses were not worth your own. He had turned around to shout something back when the ice lurched, and you spilled to the freezing floor. You looked over your shoulder, and time slowed to a crawl. There, on the far edge of the ice, a lurching monster towered out of the sea. Its hunched body rose and fell in slow motion. A frightening contrast of jet black and yellowish skin slid down the ice. For 1 second, for just a moment, in the midst of that black flesh, you saw an eye. A bluish iris encompassed by a burning red sclera. For one very long instant, you felt that eye upon you, looking into you, wanting you. And then the beast was gone. You squinted hard and took in the misty horizon. Blurry shapes moved in the waters. Shapes much like a porpoise dorsal, only larger and much darker. It was then that you felt something under the ice. Aside from the bobbing and swells of the sea, there was something else. It was prodding. Slow but deliberate, they were prodding your little island. That was when you rolled over, buried your face in your hands, and began to breathe very hard. But now you feel a hand on your shoulder. "Listen to me," a voice says. "We are not done for. We are going to gather the horses, gather our equipment, and get back onto shore. As God is my witness, we are Englishmen, and we are going to see our assignment through. Do you get me?" Slowly you open your eyes and steady your hands. "I get you." "Good. Then step 2. Slowly you push off the ice and raise yourself up. The world around you is in blurry motion. The excitement goes on. The movement does not end. You are moving too, but with purpose. Placing one sure foot in front of the other, you push into the wind with the determination to see your duty through. For 6 hours, they navigated the deadly maze, gradually getting closer ashore. Scott's team finally caught up to them and shouted to them to abandon the gear and horses, but Bowers again refused to leave them behind. While they waited, the men on shore dug out a sort of road in the snow, and finally, the opportunity came to lift the sledges up. Just as they got the second one out, their flow broke off again, and the men had to leave the ponies on the ice. Still determined to save them, Bowers led the men along the shore and looked for another opportunity to retrieve them. Eventually, their flow was close enough to the shore that Bowers and Oates decided to give it a try. There was one flow between the horses and shore, and Bowers led the first pony to make the jump. Even though it should have easily cleared it, the horses had grown stiff in the cold, and it plunged into the water. Wishing to save the pony from a painful death in the jaws of a killer whale, Oates drove a pickaxe into the skull of the screaming beast. They decided to wait for another opportunity, and when it arrived, they had trouble motivating the next horse to make the jump. Eventually, though, they got it over, and it was time for the second one. But as the horse made the jump, a killer whale breached the water, leading it to panic and swerve in midair, causing it to plunge into the black water. The men stood on the thinning ice, desperately trying to pull the horse up, but as the killer whales approached, they knew it was no use. This time Bowers drove the pickaxe into the horse, before leading the survivor up to the rest of the party. Of the 8 horses they set out with, only 2 returned. Exhausted, the men made it back to Hut Point on March 4th and made improvements to their shelter before winter set in. As they treated themselves for exhaustion and frostbite, a number of questions remained on their mind. How far had Amundsen laid his depots? Was there anything else they could do to prepare before summer? As the English mulled this over, they had no way of knowing that the Norwegians were still, as of that time, in the midst of their own depot-laying journey. Unlike the English, the Norwegians did not begin laying their depots until early February. As with Scott's expedition, the Norwegians had no relief vessels, and so Amundsen carefully considered which personnel would be essential for the next year before ordering the Fram to sail to Buenos Aires for the winter. On February 10th, Amundsen took 4 men and 18 dogs to pull 3 sledges with supplies south. When they began their journey, their only knowledge of the barrier came from books, and though they anticipated that the trip would be arduous, they had no way of knowing how successful dogs and skis would fare on the rugged terrain. To their surprise, they discovered that they worked quite well. In just 4 days, they had made it to 80 degrees south and laid their first depot before returning back to base 2 days later. Because of their good positioning and good teamwork, it took the men only a week to lay a depot as far south as it had taken the English 5 weeks to do. Considering this first depot-laying journey a test of the men and equipment, Amundsen doubled the personnel to 8 and more than doubled the sledges and dogs to 7 and 42 respectively for a second depot-laying trek. They left a week after Scott's team had turned back from their own trip, and already the temperatures had begun to drop to negative 16 degrees Fahrenheit, with strong winds blowing snow across the barrier. A week after this, the temperatures were hovering around the high negative 30s, but the men endeavored, laying more depots with their furthest at 81 degrees south. Amundsen desperately wanted to lay more supplies, at least to 83 degrees south if he could, but alas, most of the dogs simply would not survive if they pressed on. Somewhat discouraged, the Norwegians made their way back to base on March 22nd, with winter rapidly closing in around them. Still determined to make one more run before travel became impossible, Amundsen led a man-hauling party of 7 other men to transport 2,400 pounds of seal meat to their original 80 degrees south depot. They made the delivery and turned back with visibility severely reduced from worsening wind and snow. At one point, they strayed off the return path and found themselves in the midst of a field of crevasses that cost them nearly 3 days of travel time. Finally, on April 11th, they made it back to base and prepared for the long winter ahead. While the men and dogs recovered, Amundsen worked diligently to find improvements to their travel plans that coming summer. After seeing the exhaustion of the dogs, he felt that he had to increase their numbers, even at the expense of other men. He was beginning to feel a growing dissatisfaction amongst some of them, and would not have his authority challenged. If some of the malcontents could be left behind, that would be all the better. The sun sank below the horizon for the final time on April 23rd, bringing 4 months of frigid polar night. Amundsen and Scott were both aware of the incessant boredom that could develop during such times, and so worked to keep the men busy. At Hut Point, there were a number of scientists who Scott ordered his men to assist with whatever experiments they needed to conduct. When scientists weren't experimenting or writing, they were lecturing, as the men were encouraged to deliver lectures on whatever topics they were knowledgeable about. Jerry Garrard resurrected Ernest Shackleton's South Polar Times newspaper, and the men regularly organized games of football to keep in shape. Over in the Norwegian camp, there were no scientists to assist, so Amundsen kept the men busy at improving their gear and equipment. Amundsen hadn't been pleased with how his sledges had performed on the ice, and so decided to use the sledges from Nansen's expedition, which he threw in once he sold him the Fram. The men took these older sledges and reduced their weight by about a third through planing off some of the old wood and adding back some of their own spare hickory. Through the rest of the winter, the men repaired their garments, cookware, and skis, eating cloud and blueberries to keep scurvy away. As the men bided their time for summer, Amundsen was confident in his equipment, though he did feel an unknown factor lay in Scott's motorized sledges. Having had no experience with them, he could only imagine how quickly they might enable the English to pull supplies across the barrier. With this in mind, he was determined to start the trek as early as he could, by September if at all possible. Meanwhile, in the British camp, Scott too was speculating at just how soon the Norwegians could begin their journey, as they were not burdened by a mixture of transportation methods, each with its own unique needs and faults. It was in the midst of these wonderings that an opportunity arose. Dr. Wilson came to Scott anxious to add to his earlier research on penguins by going and collecting eggs in the embryo stage. Mapping out the points of development would be tremendous, but it would also mean traveling in the midst of Antarctic winter, something that had never been tried before. Scott considered the proposal and saw opportunity in it, an opportunity to see how their gear would perform, and if they could reduce their travel weight by modestly reducing the amount of rations allotted to each man. He approved a limited expedition of 3 men, pulling 2 sledges with 6 weeks' worth of food, 60 miles east to Cape Crozier for the eggs. Dr. Wilson led the expedition, with Bowers and Cherry Garrard assisting. They left on the dark morning of June 27th in the frigid negative 40-degree air. Hardship struck immediately, as Cherry Garrard was having trouble getting a grip on the sledge with his thick outer mittens. Trying to get a better grip, he decided to remove them and pull with only his thin fur gloves between his hands and the reins. By the end of the first day, he had frostbite in all 10 fingers, and what was worse, each one had inch-long blisters. The air was so cold that it caused the water within to freeze, and he was only relieved that evening when he held them over a cook fire long enough to melt them and have them pricked to let out the moisture. Imagine the pain of pulling a sledge, with fingers too stiff to bend and having literal ice cubes under your skin for hours. As the journey went on, Cherry Garrard's toes would also face frostbite, as would Wilson's soles and heels. But the day's miseries did not end when they lay down to sleep. Remember when I spoke of the differences in gear and how fur does not have that moisture-wicking capability of pelts? Well, here's a consequence of that. As the men pulled themselves into their sleeping bags, moisture from their sweat would build up along the inside of the bag and mix with the frigid polar air, freezing into an ice cake around the bag's interior. As night would go on, this ice cake would melt from body heat and soak the sleeper, causing them to wake and shiver for the rest of the night. As day would dawn, they would roll out of their bags and store them on the sledge, only all that moisture was still in there, and when they went to sleep that night, moisture would accumulate, causing a wetter night's sleep. This moisture would continue to accumulate, making the bags and therefore the sledge heavier and more difficult to pack as the cold air had more moisture to freeze, causing the bags to become rigid. By the time the men returned to camp, the bags could no longer be rolled up and instead had to be laid along the length of the sledge. Cherry Garrard's bag, which weighed 18 pounds at the outset of the journey, wound up weighing 45 by the time the trip concluded 6 weeks later. I tell you all of this so that you will keep in mind that while these men struggled for life day after day in the dead of Antarctic winter, they did it on virtually no sleep and no reprieve from misery. As I mentioned, night is eternal in Antarctic winter, so the men made their way in the dark, following the position of Jupiter to orient themselves. By July 3rd, temperatures reached a low of -60, and by July 7th, it reached a low of -77. This frigid air caused the men's goggles to fog up so badly they had to forego them, and it froze the very sweat within their clothes, so they became excruciatingly rigid. This caused their progress to reduce considerably, as the men found it so difficult to move that they were forced to relay their sledge loads to make any sort of progress over the rugged ice. A storm came up so violent that the men were unable to move for 3 days, though this was actually seen as a reprieve, as it elevated temperatures into the -20s and 30s. Once they set out again on July 13th, they fell into a crevasse which they only barely pulled themselves out of. Finally, they reached a colony of emperor penguins by the shore, which they descended upon quickly, killing 3 and taking 5 eggs. The fresh meat was revitalizing to the men's health, and the blubber served to create oil for their lamps and stove. The men desperately needed the oil, as the cork bungs of their own oil tins were permeable and leaking out quickly despite their best efforts to preserve it. At the side of the colony, the men erected a crude stone hut, covering the top with some of their tent canvas, and erected the rest of the canvas around the front to screen the wind. Space within the hut was limited, so while they slept within, they kept their cook gear and garments stored within the outer tent canvas. They spent a couple of days here, regathering themselves, storing the meat, blubber, and eggs, and preparing for the trek back through the long night. However, even here there was little reprieve. During their brief stay, a number of things went wrong. First, as they negotiated the rocky path back to the hut, Cherry Garrard took a spill, destroying 2 of the eggs he was carrying. Then, that evening, while cooking a bit of the blubber they were using to fuel the stove, a burning hot glob popped right into Dr. Wilson's open eye. He spent the rest of the night, quote, unable to stifle his groans. Dr. Wilson recorded privately in his journal that he thought that they had hit rock bottom that night, but matters grew worse as a maelstrom descended upon the camp. They reinforced their canvas roof with stones to keep it from blowing away and rode out nearly 24 hours in their sleeping bags while 70-mile-per-hour wind gusts raged around them. Cherry Garrard recalled that they were all irritable and despondent. He himself contemplated death, and it was only the singing of songs and hymns that kept the men sane through the tempest. When the wind eventually abated, they poked their heads out to discover the tent and most of their belongings had disappeared in the storm. They spent hours sifting through the snow, finding most but not all of their lost gear. They barely rigged their stove together, which was missing a number of parts, and cooked their first hot meal in 48 hours. They decided they could not remain here for much longer, and so on July 25th, nearly a month since they left Hut Point, they headed north once again. 7 days later, the men caught their first glimpse of twilight, giving them all a much-needed morale boost. 4 days after that, they made it back to base and collapsed into the relative comfort of the hut. This concluded what Cherry Garrard titled his memoir as The Worst Journey in the World. All in all, the journey was considered a success. The men had retrieved the penguin eggs, and they had each lost less than 4 pounds despite the reduced rations. Scott once again went back to the drawing board and drew up plans for how they would journey over the barrier and onto the plateau. With the most exciting events of winter behind them, the explorers looked to the east, eagerly awaiting the first rays of sun and for the proverbial starting gun of summer to sound. But the competitors in this race were far from equal footing. In this heat, the opponents were invisible, and there were no clear starting or ending lines. Its runners chased the game's ultimate prize and were willing to give the ultimate sacrifice to reach it. Such sacrifices were indeed made, but whether they were made in success or in vain is what we will discuss next time on the final episode of Ends of the Earth. Yes, folks, there is going to be another episode. I do apologize for the build-up, but I can at the very least promise you that the wait won't be nearly as long. As with previous two-parters, the next episode should be out in just about 2 weeks. I sincerely appreciate everyone who has held out as long as you have since our last entry. Michael and I never intended to make you wait this long. As I mentioned in the previous episode, the show is going to go through some retooling after this, which we hope will prove to be a better experience, both for us as creators, as well as for you as listeners. Nevertheless, thank you to everyone who continues to listen. And in case you're new to the show, I'd like to let you know that you can follow us on most major social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Any show updates or bonus content will show up there, so check us out. And while you're there, feel free to leave us a comment. A big reason we decided to start the show was to start a conversation about the history we cover, and your feedback is sincerely appreciated. But until next time, I'm Graham Parker, you've been listening to Grisly History, and I hope to see you all on the next one.